Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the 8th online seminar for safeguarding ICH in the Asia-Pacific region. My name is Hitomi Yamamoto, Associate Fellow of IRCI, and I will be your MC today. Today's seminar is part of a series hosted by the Asia-Pacific Research Forum for ICH Safeguarding, a platform established by IRCI to promote research and international cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. This seminar continues our exploration of the intricate relationship between intangible cultural heritage and climate change, a theme that has become increasingly important. It is co-organized by IRCI's new project, Research on Intangible Cultural Heritage and Climate Change in the Asia-Pacific region, which began in April 2024. We are pleased to have Ms. Lisa HIWASAKI, Associate Professor for Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island, USA, and Associate Researcher for the Institut en Environnement, Développement et Société at Université Laval, Canada, as our lecturer. Ms. HIWASAKI brings over 20 years of experience working with the UN and international organizations in Southeast Asia, focusing on vulnerability, equity, and the adaptive capacities of coastal communities. Her insights will be invaluable in understanding how Indigenous and local knowledge can enhance adaptive capacity, particularly in the context of climate change. Joining us as a commentator is Mr. Christopher Ballard, Associate Professor for College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University, Australia. Mr. Ballard is a renowned historian and anthropologist with extensive experience working with Indigenous communities in the Pacific Islands and Eastern Indonesia. His expertise in managing Vanuatu's first UNESCO World Heritage Site and collaborating on intangible cultural heritage projects will provide a rich perspective on our discussion. Now it is our pleasure to welcome Ms. Lisa HIWASAKI. Her presentation leveraging local and Indigenous knowledge to enhance adaptive capacity, examples from Southeast Asian coastal communities will explore how Indigenous people and local communities have traditionally used their knowledge to adapt to crisis, including climate change and disaster risk. She will discuss how these adaptations can be supported equitably, ensuring their knowledge thrives in an uncertain future. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Lisa HIWASAKI.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning to those of you in Asia and the Pacific. Good evening to those of us in the Americas. Wherever you are, thank you for taking the time to be with me today. Thank you also to the International Research Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage in the Asia-Pacific region for inviting me to give this seminar. I also want to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from the University of Rhode Island in the United States, which occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. So as I have been introduced, my name is Lisa HIWASAKI, and I'm a scholar of vulnerability and equity of communities marginalized in development processes in the Global South. My research is and has been in Southeast Asia, where I lived and worked. I lived in Indonesia for 4 years, implementing scientific and educational projects while working for the United Nations Educational and Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and 3 years in Vietnam, managing an agricultural research for development program for an international consortium of agricultural research organizations. As a development professional with over 20 years of experience, I worked with Indigenous people and ethnic minorities during my career. I do not intend to speak for those people, but what I have attempted to do during my career and continue to do so since I became an academic a few years ago is to be an advocate for valorization and recognition of such practices and knowledges. And of course, the people who own them. Yet I do want to acknowledge that as a scholar in a North American university of a non-Indigenous background who has received most of her education from Western institutions, when I go to the field, there are power imbalances between me as the researcher and the informants or the people I work with in the field. As a result of my experience in the past 20 years or so, I have had the opportunity to advocate for the use of local and Indigenous knowledge in science and policy, and I hope to continue to be able to do so in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and other local communities, so long as they allow me to play such a role. So what I hope to do in the next 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes or so, is to highlight the important role of local and Indigenous knowledge to enhance the adaptive capacity of the holders of such knowledge. I just want to make sure that you can see the slides are moving. Yes?
Yes, they are moving.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Indigenous people and local communities have used their own knowledge and practices to help them overcome crises, shocks, stresses in the past, and they continue to do so today. So how can we make sure that local and Indigenous knowledge continues to thrive and play an essential part of these communities' capacities in the future? And more importantly, how can local and Indigenous knowledge and practices lead to adaptations that are equitable and just? And what I mean by that is adaptations that do not reinforce existing vulnerabilities or create new ones. In order to address these questions, I will structure my talk as follows. As a way of introduction, I will start with some definitions of key terms I will be using in my presentation. I also want to provide background information from scientific literature on the important role of local and Indigenous knowledge in helping communities deal with crises in the past and in the present. Next, I give some examples of such knowledge that we have documented among and with coastal communities in Southeast Asia, and discuss the concepts of adaptation and maladaptation with some examples. I would then like to move on to address key questions on how these communities can continue to adapt to these myriad stresses in an uncertain future. How can we support adaptations in ways that do not reinforce existing vulnerabilities or create new ones? I believe that how we respond to these questions will be crucial to ensure that such knowledge continues to thrive, enabling equitable adaptation. So we will start with definitions. First, what do I mean when I say local and Indigenous knowledge? The definition of local and Indigenous knowledge that I use is the one used by UNESCO's LINKS, the Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems Program. This broad definition encompasses the various terms that are frequently used in different contexts, such as these terms you can see on the slide here. Up until the 1990s, local and Indigenous knowledge had been regarded as inferior to science and technology, as mere mysticism or superstitions. Relying on use of such knowledge was considered as a factor that hindered development of Indigenous peoples. Fortunately, since then, such attitudes have largely shifted, and the positive contribution of local and Indigenous knowledge to enable cost-effective, participatory, and sustainable natural resource management have become widely acknowledged by development practitioners. Donors and development agencies have been promoting the protection, use, dissemination, and transmission of such knowledge since the 1990s. In the field of disaster risk reduction, evidence that local knowledge and practices can improve disaster preparedness has grown since the early 2000s, And similarly, scientists have studied Indigenous knowledge and its relevance in our understanding of climate change and adaptation strategies. Initially, much of this research focused on the Arctic and the Pacific. In the past decade, we have seen an explosion in the amount of research on the topic, and I'm sure you, the people tuning into this seminar, are well aware of the importance of local and Indigenous knowledge. But I do want to underline that such knowledge and practices have been officially recognized in the sphere of climate governance and policies, such as in the Paris Agreement and the latest IPCC report. I should note that the IPCC has acknowledged the importance of Indigenous knowledge and climate adaptation since its fourth assessment report in 2007, as well as in its fifth assessment report in 2014. But the latest report goes beyond adaptation and talking more largely about solutions. And of course, I do want to mention that the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction also acknowledges the importance of such knowledges and practices in disaster risk reduction, which also builds upon the 2005 Hyogo Framework for Action, which highlighted the importance of local knowledge in resilience building. I also want to draw your attention to a recent guidelines document published in 2022 on the topic by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which outlines ways in which local and Indigenous knowledge can help us reduce risks from disasters. Before I move on to sharing with you some concrete examples of such knowledge and practices, I want to take some time to give some background information on why such knowledge and practices can enhance adaptive capacities. Local and Indigenous knowledge, link here, is at the center, at the core of capacity. What is capacity? I'm going to let you read. So if you look at this slide, this next slide, sorry, what capacities consist of, you can see what I mean. Local and Indigenous knowledge is an important component of resources that people have, the assets that people possess that they use in order to prevent, resist, cope with, and recover from challenges brought by stresses and shocks. So what you see on the screen, what's in the orange obviously is local knowledge, but you can see in terms of whether it's decision-making skills, traditional architecture, protection of biodiversity. Local and Indigenous knowledge is relevant and are used in almost all assets that comprise capacities. An important thing to note here is that, as Wisner and his colleagues say, that this concept of capacity also includes the ability to use or access the needed resources. That's going beyond just the mere availability of these resources. This is an important point that I will come back to later in the presentation. It is with this understanding of local and Indigenous knowledge and its central role in capacities of people that we can say, as Ellen and his colleagues have dedicated an entire book on, how communities in Southeast Asia have used their own knowledge, and often in combination with other knowledges, including scientific knowledge, to deal with crises in the past and in the present. One thing Ellen and other scholars of local and Indigenous knowledge emphasize is the dynamic and flexible nature of such knowledge. Which is another point to which I will come back later. I'm now going to provide you with some examples of local and Indigenous knowledge. But before that, I want to provide you with some background on the research out of which the local and Indigenous knowledge I am sharing with you today came about. First is a set of research projects implemented more than 10 years ago, between 2011 and 2013, in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Timor-Leste, that aim to strengthen the resilience of coastal communities in these three countries by highlighting the use of local and indigenous knowledge related to climate-related hazards. The study sites for this set of projects can be seen in this slide. The second set of research projects focus on inequalities, vulnerabilities, and equitable development of coastal communities in Indonesia and Vietnam. And field research for these sites started in 2023 in these sites you see here, and we are currently in the process of analyzing the vulnerability and capacity mapping of these coastal communities, as well as documenting with local researchers local and indigenous knowledge that they have used and are using to help them with their livelihoods. For the purpose of this seminar, I'm not going to go into the details on the methodology and information on these sites, but I would be happy to talk about them if there are any questions later. For both sets of research, it was clear that coastal and small island communities in these countries have used and continue to use a wealth of knowledge and practices embedded in their long histories of interacting with the environment and observing its changes. I will share with you some of the local knowledge documented, categorized into the four broad groups you can see on this slide. First is the folklore, rituals, and ceremonies, such as ceremonies and festivals that commemorate divine beings, demonstrate appreciation for nature, and ask for protection from hazards. These reinforce respect for nature, increase people's awareness of hazards and other dangers, and strengthen community cohesion. Second group of local knowledge is customary laws that govern behavior, in particular use of resources. And that includes customary laws that ban logging in certain areas and maintain vegetation, for example, or prohibition against building houses in certain regions. And these customary laws enforce social norms and maintain order, and engender and reinforce respect for the environment as well as relations among the members of the society. The third group is local food, materials, and structures, such as construction of disaster-resilient houses using local materials and methods, food processing and preservation methods. And these enable communities to adapt to, mitigate, and prepare for shocks and other stressors. And the last category I want to mention is observations of environmental and climatic changes and other natural phenomena, for example, prediction of storms based on observations of changes in the sky, sea, wind, waves, current, atmosphere, etc., which help communities predict hazards and make decisions about whether to go out to sea or take action to protect their houses, etc. So starting with this category first, in all countries we worked in, ceremonies and festivals that commemorate divine beings, demonstrate appreciation for nature, and ask for protection from hazards were documented. When hazards do occur, rituals are held to stop them or to apologize to nature. In the Philippines, for example, it is believed that festivities to commemorate Catholic saints, which have been syncretized with relevant deities under the Institut belief system, are necessary to avoid suffering or disasters. Otherwise, the saint will get mad, causing floods or drought. The idea of human behavior causing hazards or the perception of hazards as a curse was also found in other countries. In Sangihe, Indonesia, the sudden and out-of-season appearance of westerly winds meant that a serious moral offense had been committed. Rituals to apologize to nature practiced in all the three Timorese sites stem from the belief that disasters are caused by nature's curse, which is brought on by people breaking rules, such as killing snakes, which are considered as landlords, cutting down sacred trees such as teak, bamboo, and gamelina trees, or removing sacred stones. In south central coast of Vietnam, whales are honored and worshipped as ong, as it is believed that whales help fishermen in distress or respond to their calls for help at sea. Festivals are held to pray for favorable weather with calm seas and good fishing conditions. For small island and coastal communities, the sea is the primary source of their livelihood, and at the same time, the sea can threaten their lives. People are in awe of nature and hazards caused by it, but they also see hazards and other dangers at sea as something that they can prevent or mitigate. Interviews with experts and validation with communities demonstrate the important role religious beliefs and traditional beliefs manifested in these rituals and ceremonies, and how they play an important role in strengthening social cohesion. When hazards turn into disasters, religious faith provides inner strength to believers, and disaster survivors cite these beliefs as enabling them to cope better with suffering, endure calamities, maintain stability, and strengthen social cohesion. Interestingly, communities almost always assessed folklore, rituals, and ceremony as 100% or very effective during the validation process, demonstrating their significance. However, in Timor-Leste, villagers emphasized that the continued effectiveness of this knowledge to be used to prevent disasters depended on the goodwill of new generations. That is to say, it is up to the young generation whether these rituals will continue to be effective to stop hazards. That's for these people. The role religious and traditional beliefs will continue to play to prevent and mitigate climate-related hazards and engender and reinforce respect for nature and strengthen social cohesion depends on how well such beliefs are maintained and are transmitted to the younger generations. Customary laws concerning the environment play a major role in preventing and mitigating disasters, at the same time enforcing social norms, reinforcing respect for the environment, and structuring social relations within communities. Many such regulations and institutions were documented, especially in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. Some are strictly enforced with punishments such as fines, while others are voluntary. By maintaining and protecting the coastal environment, customary laws help prevent and mitigate risks arising from the environment, including from the sea and climate hazards. An example I want to share with you is Hutan Pasir, a coastal forest in Aceh, Indonesia, used to mitigate impacts of high waves, strong sea winds, and coastal erosion. The cross-section of Hutan Pasir in this slide consists of several rows of different trees and plants along the seashore to protect paddy fields from salty winds, and they act as a wind buffer to protect houses from damage. Acehese customary law considers these areas as conservation areas, with fines imposed for violation, and were managed by Panglima Laut, the fishermen's organization. Unfortunately, these coastal forests were destroyed by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and as a result, at the time research was conducted, strong winds regularly destroyed houses and paddy fields, as you can see in the second half of this slide. Last year, during our field research in Simelu, we found that Panglima Laut continues to play an important role among fishermen in Aceh. For example, they enforce monitoring and surveillance of what and when to catch fish and the size of fish that can be caught. When customary laws that govern behavior concerning the environment become official laws or promoted by government entities, social norms and relations and respect for the environment are strengthened. Thus, by ensuring that customary laws are officially recognized and maintained, it is possible not only to prevent and mitigate hazards and climate change impacts, but also strengthen social cohesion, which can contribute to increased ability to respond to shocks and stresses. Communities use local food and materials to help them prepare for, mitigate, or adapt better to impacts of shocks and stresses, including climate-related hazards. Houses are strengthened, as you can see in this slide, an example from Timor-Leste, or elevated and coastal structures are built using local materials or plants. Local food is processed and preserved in ways to ensure alternative sources of food during hazards, as people cannot go out to fish during storms or after due to transportation disruptions. During community validation, it was found that knowledge and practices in this group were least likely to be considered by all participants as effective against climate-related hazards. Perhaps because of this, we found that these knowledge and practices were more readily replaced by new methods or structures. In Sayong, Indonesia, it was documented that recently introduced stilt houses, such as this one, are preferred by communities to adapt to coastal flooding, perhaps because the traditional practice of using sand is no longer effective. In Kindahe and Lipang, Indonesia, it was found that the scale of abrasion taking place in recent years has made it difficult for communities to tackle by using only traditional mechanisms. Local food, materials, and structures, while they can help communities, need to be carefully examined to determine their effectiveness in their abilities to help communities adapt to and prepare for shocks and stresses. Whether such knowledge should be transmitted would need to be considered case by case, especially in light of new technologies and considering such traditional practices may not be as effective due to climatic and other changes, including environmental degradation, globalization, and population growth. This is a point I will come back to in the next section. Extensive knowledge related to the observation of the sun, moon, stars, winds, clouds, and the sea, including the waves, current, and temperatures, to predict climate-related hazards and make decisions about whether to go out to sea or take action to protect villages and houses, was documented in all sites, as were observations of animal, insect, and plant behavior. I know this is a lot of small print. I just wanted to provide an example of such observations from each country. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain the first example in this slide. Observation of dark towering clouds at the horizon and their upward movement from winds in combination with position of a beehive in a tree, calm sea weather during transition period according to the traditional calendar, and rancid smell from the sea predicts angin badi, which is strong winds and high waves. Observations of various changes in the environment, combined with the timing of these events in the year, were perceived by coastal and small island communities as extremely effective in predicting climate-related hazards. Such knowledge is often devised into traditional seasonal calendars, which were documented in all sites in Indonesia and in our more recent field research in Vietnam. These calendars are composed of highly complex, systematized environmental observations that are specific to each locale, which guide fisherfolk and farmers in their livelihood activities. They also govern social relations by determining, for example, when ceremonies and weddings can be held, and enable communities to predict the arrival of seasons as well as floods, storms, big waves, and droughts. Traditional calendars are usually orally transmitted and are often embedded in day-to-day rituals or festivals. Although efforts to officially document them are increasing, it was acknowledged in Sayong, Kentahe, and Lipang, Indonesia, that only older people above 50 years of age now have this complex, detailed knowledge of the calendars. It should be noted that while knowledge related to hazard prediction can be extremely useful to help communities adapt to climate change, such knowledge can also become less reliable in predicting hazards due to climate change. And this brings me to the next point concerning adaptation and maladaptation. So how can we use local and indigenous knowledge to enhance adaptive capacities of coastal communities whose livelihoods depend on the natural environment and are thus susceptible to changes in their surroundings? Before tackling this topic, we need to take a step back and ask the question, what should adaptation look like, especially in the context of climate change? The challenges surrounding adaptation to climate change are numerous, and it is beyond the scope of this seminar to review the literature of more than 30 years on this topic, in particular, the challenge of adaptation and its interface with sustainable development in the Global South. What studies of both development and adaptation projects over the years have shown us is that these strategies have led to a spectrum of adaptive and maladaptive outcomes, as you can see here. Effective adaptation, where adaptation has led to long-term positive impact on communities and ideally towards climate resilient pathway, is on the one end, whereas on the other end is maladaptation, when poorly designed adaptation strategies lead to conditions that are worse than before. That is to say, when communities become even more likely to be negatively impacted by climate change. From the literature on maladaptation, what is clear are first, adaptation needs to address the root causes of vulnerability, which arise from systemic inequalities due to historical and existing power structures. And second, in order to support people to adapt effectively, it is necessary to ensure they have a range of options, especially livelihood assets and strategies, from which they can draw. So the first point on vulnerability. I want to share with you a couple of quotes here on the literature, from the literature on the link between adaptation, or rather maladaptation, vulnerability, and inequality. And I'll let you read the quotes. Although we tend to talk about vulnerable groups and refer to women or poor people or indigenous people as vulnerable, or we tend to talk about vulnerable countries, most notably countries in the Global South, vulnerability is not, as Schipper says in this slide, vulnerability is not an inherent characteristic that people are born with. Rather, vulnerability arises from a process by which people with certain characteristics are made to be more susceptible or exposed to negative shocks and stresses due to power structures and inequalities that exist in a society. That is why scholars agree that unless these power structures that reinforce inequalities are addressed, effective adaptation cannot occur. And this brings us back to something I raised earlier in my presentation when I talked about capacity using this figure, the circle of capacities. Wisner and his colleagues say that the concept of capacity goes beyond mere availability of these resources. So it's not enough that these resources, political, natural, human, etc., are available. People must also be able to use and access the needed resources. If a community or certain groups within communities are not able to use because they do not have access to resources due to inequitable distribution of wealth, or they're unable to participate in decision-making, they are not able to fully use their capacity. Wisner and his colleagues also say that in order to enhance capacities, it is necessary to strengthen the wide range of people's strategies to face stresses and shocks. This leads us to the second point, that to support people to adapt effectively, it is necessary to ensure they have a wide range of options, especially livelihood assets and strategies, from which they can draw on. In other words, examples of maladaptation are in effect cases of people not having access to a wide range of livelihood assets and strategies. So some examples of maladaptation from the literature include building hydroelectric dam and putting in place forest protection policies to regulate floods in lowland Vietnam, for example, may have been successful at reducing vulnerability to specific hazards in the lowlands. At the same time, these measures undermine access to land and forest resources for ethnic minorities who live in the mountains. They are thus not able to control their resources and use their own knowledges and practices to govern these resources. Thus, the adaptive capacity of these ethnic minorities is reduced. Another example of maladaptation is the case of pastoralists in the lowlands of Ethiopia, who were forced to resettle as part of the country's climate-resilient green economy strategy. And that led to decreased livelihood options for them, since they were no longer able to engage in pastoralism. Thus, this has led to exacerbated vulnerability for pastoralists. The last example I want to give is the case of villagers who did not evacuate at the time of the 2006 Mount Merapi eruption in Indonesia. Although extensive monitoring systems and official warning told villagers to evacuate, they refused to come down from the volcano. While it is true that these people did not evacuate, partly due to their own culturally specific early warning system, local and indigenous knowledge, another important reason they did not evacuate is because they were concerned about abandoning their livestock, which is the village's sole investment. So to avoid maladaptation, that is to say, to enhance adaptive capacities, therefore, it is necessary first to address the root causes of vulnerability. And second, it is necessary to ensure people have a range of options, especially livelihood strategies. And that is what, in my view, enhanced adaptive capacity would look like. And what I want to highlight in my presentation is how we can leverage local and indigenous knowledge to avoid maladaptation. I want to dedicate the remaining 10 minutes or so of my presentation to address two questions that are, in my view, key to ensure that local and indigenous knowledge continues to thrive, enabling equitable adaptation. In order to address these questions, I want to share more results from the research we have been conducting since 2022 in Indonesia and Vietnam, because there we've learned from the communities many examples of how they have been adapting to changes. Starting from colonialism, trade, wars, political and governance changes, they've had many changes and they've been adapting to them. And I want to share what we learned in these communities that we worked with. And more about the recent changes they've been adapting to in the past 20 years or so. So I'm going to start with Vietnam. So Vietnamese fishermen in central south coast of Vietnam have been impacted by fluctuation in market demand, such as the drop in price of fish and seafood, unstable demand, increase in the price of oil, vessel, and nets, and as well environmental changes, decline in aquatic resources. They attribute ecosystem destruction due to illegal fishing methods and overfishing, water pollution from the nearby coal power plant, industrial waste discharge, and change in ocean currents. They all reduce fish catches. And there's also a seasonal increase in water temperature, leading to increased mortality rates for aquaculture farmers. And then, of course, they've observed storms and strong winds. One of the biggest shocks in recent years for them, though, was the COVID pandemic. Disruption of supply chain, significantly reduced demand for seafood, and also drop in price of seafood. On top of that, a recent policy change that impacted them was the requirement to install navigation system for boats longer than 15 meters, which makes sense for safety reasons, but this resulted in high service and subscription fees for the fishermen. So with these impacts, these stressors, they've had to make changes into their livelihood activities. Whether it's the use of different fishing vessels, equipment, or they've had to change from nearshore fishing to aquaculture or doing more offshore fishing, which means they have to go further out, spend more time at sea, which requires sophisticated equipment, greater fuel consumption, and longer fishing trips, which increase operational costs and expose fishermen to greater risks. They've also had to change fishing methods from more traditional coconut fiber made nets to nylon nets and bigger ones, and using larger boats, wooden boats to plastic boats, or go to work in bigger boats or work in nearby provinces, thus by becoming wage laborers. Or for aquaculture farmers, they've had to relocate aquaculture operation further offshore, which incur additional costs and logistical challenges. There are also those who've had to change livelihoods from fishermen to tourism. In terms of Indonesia, they too have had fluctuation in market demand, increased prices for fish. But an important impact, the stress that they experienced, of course, the fishermen in Aceh, were the impact of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. And the long-lasting impacts of tsunami was that, according to the villagers, they say after the tsunami, plantation crops failed, and there were less fish available near shore. And they were unable to predict the amount of fish they can get. And of course, they've noticed increased meteorological hazards, drought leading to rice crop failures, flooding, and strong winds causing damages to houses. Another thing to note in the Indonesian Achenese context is the armed conflict. The Free Aceh movement, following intense resistance to Dutch colonial rule in the region, led to people seeking refuge in Pusong Island, which is one of the field sites we worked with. So these changes have all led to changes in livelihood activities, such as shifting fishing from offshore to nearshore to further offshore, and spending more time fishing using boats with engines, which they didn't use before. And women have had to also take a bigger role in and concentrate on intensified rice paddy production. I also want to share with you this historical profiling that was done by my Indonesian colleagues of two villages in Simono Island, which basically shows this long history of adaptation to external shocks. So first, before, pre-1907, which is the other big earthquake that took place in the Simono Islands, most of the people there were doing paddy rice farming. Then later, they've started clove plantation, and clove plantations were encouraged by the post-independence government after the 1950s to plant cloves for cash crops. But then in the 1970s and 80s, some of the prices of the cloves dropped, so they've had to seek other livelihood opportunities outside of the villages and also take up fishing as a primary source of livelihoods. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, once again, their main livelihood option became rice farming. And then more recently, with increase in tourism and especially international surfing tourism. So what this slide tells us that there are a wide range of livelihood options that similar islanders resort to in order to adapt to various outside stressors, whether it's fluctuations in market prices or tsunami. In fact, many changes in the environment that we would attribute to climate change existed before and are explained by coastal communities differently. For example, tsunami decreasing the amount of fish that can be caught closer to the coast, and increasing sedimentation in the sea, or outside fishermen using illegal fishing methods that degrade coral reefs. So as you can see in this slides, environmental changes, including changes in the climate, are just one of the various pressures that coastal communities face. Outside shocks that are mentioned the most in Aceh was tsunami, and in Vietnam, it was the COVID pandemic. So my answer to the first question on how these communities can continue to adapt to these myriad stressors, my answer would be by continuing to have access to and are able to use a range of options, especially livelihood assets and strategies. Local and indigenous knowledge would be a key component of these assets and strategies central to adaptive capacity. But as I mentioned earlier, some of these knowledges and practices may not necessarily continue to help communities in their adaptation to stressors, including environmental degradation, globalization, population growth, and climate change. And this brings me back to another point that I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that scholars and local and indigenous knowledge emphasize the dynamic and flexible nature of such knowledge. So making sure that local and indigenous knowledge is given room to continue to be dynamic and flexible is important. Concerning the second question, how we can support adaptations in ways that do not reinforce existing vulnerabilities or create new ones, my answer to that would be adaptation that addresses the root causes of vulnerabilities. Adaptation that prioritizes equity, especially focusing on people marginalized through development processes. And there are plenty of examples of articles and publications that attest to the importance of this. And these are just a couple of references that you can refer to if you, for those of you who are interested in this topic. And on this point, I want to mention the fact that local and indigenous knowledge can be unevenly distributed within a community, reflecting the existing power dynamics within groups based on factors such as gender, age, and clan affiliations. And this results in unequal access to such knowledge within communities, which can increase the vulnerability of certain groups. Our current research in Vietnam, for example, identified certain ceremonies that do not allow women or the sick to participate. And we're in the process of analyzing what other kinds of unequal access to knowledges and practices exist. Efforts to support strengthening of adaptive capacities would need to keep this in mind so that existing power dynamics that contribute to increased marginalization of some members within a community would not be reinforced. Ultimately, the objective of my research is to work with local and Indigenous communities to support them so that their knowledge and practice continue to thrive and equitable adaptation can be enabled. Equitable adaptation that do not reinforce existing vulnerabilities or create new ones. Before ending, I want to share with you some work that I've written or contributed to in the past year. There's a publication by the Ocean Panel on Indigenous and local knowledge. The middle one is the Nexus Assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, as well as a special journal issue on inequalities and vulnerabilities that I co-edited. These were all published last year. And last but not least, I do want to acknowledge the communities who shared with us their knowledge and practices that are presented in this seminar today, as well as my research partners in Southeast Asia. So with that, I pass the mic to Dr. Ballard, who I'm sure will make the link of what I've talked today to intangible cultural heritage. And I would love to hear from others on other answers to the questions that I have posted in my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. HIWASAKI, for your insightful presentation. It highlighted the successful adaptation strategies of Indigenous and local knowledge, local communities using their traditional knowledge, which is crucial for overcoming crisis. The presentation also underscored the importance of supporting equitable adaptation efforts that allow this knowledge to continue thriving and enhancing its adaptive capacity. Now we would like to welcome Mr. Christopher Ballard for his comments.
Thank you very much, Hitomi, and thank you, Lisa, for a fantastic presentation. This is really important research. I've been reading earlier work of Lisa's, and there's a real evolution in that thought too, as things have become more complex, as more ideas have fed into this broader structure that she described in her earlier papers. And I think the real focus on addressing equity and the root causes of vulnerability is terribly important. So the focus as well on sort of practical inputs to policy and planning and implementation, I think is terribly important for heritage scholars who have an interest in ICH and who have an interest in climate change and disaster risk reduction. And I'd also like to commend Lisa's work at bridging this gap that seems to be there or seems to have developed between disaster risk reduction work and climate change adaptation. It's astonishing how often these two seem to be almost separate paths of evolution in thought and discussion and policy. And yet, as we know, working with communities, working with knowledge bearers, most people experience climate change, not in terms of tiny shifts in, say, sea level rise or temperature, but in terms of changes in the nature of threat, the nature of hazard that they're confronted with. And that has been the solid focus of disaster risk reduction for the last 30 or 40 years. I think disaster risk reduction was also quicker to move towards an acknowledgement and an attempt to integrate local and Indigenous knowledge systems. So I really think there needs to be a much stronger, much more vibrant conversation between the climate change literature and the disaster risk reduction. And somewhere in there, obviously, LINK and ICH interests need to be added to the mix. So I'd really like to commend Lisa's work at kind of pulling these two together and talking about vulnerability in the context of climate change. There are people doing this, but there needs to be a lot more of that work. Thinking as somebody from an ICH perspective, and this is a seminar series on ICH research and climate change, in a sense, the beauty of the ICH Convention is that both it insists upon community-led definition of what that heritage and what that knowledge looks like. And I think that's terribly important. It doesn't just mean listening and inviting participation. It actually means listening to the ways in which people frame and discuss and define these challenges. So not saying we've got a scientific challenge, what do you know about it? But how do you actually see the challenge? What's the vocabulary that you use? And I'm thinking of a colleague in Vanuatu who's made the distinction between disaster, the term in English, and disaster, which is the term in the Vanuatu Creole, bislama. And the two don't map onto each other. Certainly not, they overlap, but they don't map onto each other. So being alert to local vernacular understandings and concepts and ideas and vocabularies, super important for the work that we do. And I think the convention is very good at foregrounding that those community understandings. The convention also embraces all forms of local and Indigenous knowledge and insists as well on urban knowledge and knowledge amongst things like scientists who also have their own intangible cultural heritage. We forget that sometimes. We think of scientific knowledge on one hand and local knowledge on the other, as though they're these two separate bubbles. They've always been in conversation, and scientific knowledge has developed and evolved in conversation with local forms of knowledge, and is also itself always a form of local knowledge. Scientific knowledge today has these kind of conventions. It has cultures, if you like, which are profoundly similar to what we think of as local and Indigenous knowledge. I'd also like to introduce the idea of subconscious ICH. So we tend to rely on interviewing people, talking with people, bearers, about what they know. Sometimes they practice and enact and embody knowledge that is not articulated and not consciously transmitted. Things like the locations of villages that might have been in place for centuries. Why have they been where they are? Because people have triangulated, have brought together observations on tsunamis and landslides and cyclones, and they've worked out the best place to put those villages. If you ask somebody resident in that village today, why is your village here? The answer you're likely to get is because it's always been here. But there's a profound centuries-old ICH that has determined why these village locations are where they are. So we need to be alert to that as well, that our questions are never going to tease out the full complexity of what ICH is. And that came home to me really strongly, and I really appreciated Lisa's reference to conflict when working with knowledge bearers in the Philippines, who made the point, and this was during COVID, that they were confronted by threats from COVID, conflict, and cyclones or hurricanes. And they didn't distinguish between them. They didn't sort of have separate compartmentalized responses to these different sources of threat. They had to come up with unified responses. And so again, coming back to the way in which people prioritize livelihoods in that broadest sense, and generate strategies that respond to multiple threats, some of which we aren't alert to. That kind of leads me to my next point, which is this distinction between adaptation and maladaptation. And that's worked very well in biology and zoology and ecology, the fields in which that distinction was really first developed and defined. I'm not sure that it always works terribly well with people and with communities, because what we tend to do is approach the question of, say, maladaptation from a particular angle with a particular agenda. So volcanologists or people interested in disaster risk reduction at Mount Merapi, a volcano in Java, fail to understand why communities stay on the slopes of the volcano, live there as their ancestors have done, and put themselves at risk from volcanic eruption. And there have been catastrophic losses of thousands of people in recent eruptions. But what we're not doing there is understanding that this is not maladaptation. This is a very different calculus of risk that's organized around people's livelihoods. And many Marapi villagers have made the calculation that, yes, there is this extraordinary risk of death from the volcano, but the volcano is also what supplies the rich soils and the higher incomes that come from living in place. And they also have their ancestors buried in location. It's their land. And attempts by the Indonesian government to relocate them after major eruptions have not worked, certainly not worked from a local perspective. So adaptation and maladaptation is a very difficult divide. And I think it's a flexible one, something that looks like a maladaptation in one context might turn out to be a very useful adaptation over a different time frame or from a different perspective, and particularly from the perspective of the communities. I liked very much that Lisa also pointed out this kind of the idea that both science and local and Indigenous knowledge are constantly evolving, and we have to give them that freedom. And I think the key word probably is agency to evolve. So not in a sense define things as maladaptation. So, you know, you've really got to move off the slopes of the volcano, but really try to understand from their perspective why it is that they've made that calculation of risk differently from professional disaster risk reduction managers. I think in many ways the central importance of Lisa's presentation today, and something we really need to take away as a lesson, is this question of what adaptation to climate change is going to look like, and particularly the implementation of adaptation. And I really strongly believe that most states, all states, are basically incapable of designing adaptation at the kind of local level that many of our knowledge communities live. They simply don't have access to the information about local topography, local weather, local livelihoods to make those kinds of assessments about adaptation to climate change. So the key, I think, as Lisa has signaled, is enhancing their adaptive capacity. What is it that local communities need to do the work of implementing climate change adaptation? Because they will be the ones doing it, not the states. So I'm sorry, I've talked rather quickly and covered rather a lot there, and I hope I haven't taken up too much time, but I would really like to commend the presentation and commend the work that Lisa is doing, and encourage people to really engage with these recent publications of hers and anything else that she continues to publish in this field, because it's enormously important. So thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you, Mr. Ballard, for your comment. Now let's move on to the Q&A session. Before I invite Ms. HIWASAKI to answer questions from our online audience, I would like to ask Mr. Ballard to pose some questions.
Thank you, Hitomi. I think I've sort of signaled a few questions that we might want to explore, which is particularly where does ICH, and many of those listening today have a heritage background, where does ICH and the 2003 convention contribute to the work that Lisa and others are doing using local Indigenous knowledge as a framework? How might the convention contribute to that work and that discussion? Something that I didn't touch on, but I think we also need to be conscious of, and Lisa has signaled it, is the importance of transmission. So we talk a lot about the safeguarding of ICH and of local knowledge. But again, if we're really interested in the agency of bearer communities, then it's actually giving communities and ensuring that communities have the capacity to continue to transmit knowledge and allow it to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. So transmission and safeguarding, which is of course a core issue for ICH. And then perhaps the third sort of general question is this one about how we implement climate change adaptation at a local level. So if I could sort of frame those three areas perhaps for discussion. They're areas of interest to me, and I'm sure there will be many other questions raised. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, Chris, very nice to meet you finally online, because I know we've corresponded quite a bit over email with your very interesting work with the UNESCO Convention on ICH and climate change. So it's really nice to finally have this opportunity to talk, and your comments really it's such an honor to receive these comments from you. I guess I do want to mention a few things in response to your questions. So I think I've always been so frustrated by the silos in which different disciplines work. And you mentioned, Chris, a bit earlier in your comments about how, disaster risk reduction, disaster field and climate field have evolved separately to the detriment of both fields, I think. And similarly, I think ICH and local and indigenous knowledge have evolved separately, even though there's so many overlaps. And as I remember when I was with UNESCO working with the local and indigenous knowledge systems program, only being very vaguely made aware of the whole convention that was adopted only a year or so before I started at UNESCO, and thinking, why, are we not talking to each other? So I really think it is good, and I know that at least when I've read the recent work of ICH, when I look at it, it does valorize local and indigenous knowledge. At the same time, it hasn't really gone, well, maybe it has now. It's been a while since I left UNESCO. But, the fact that, it's a really good question how the ICH work can contribute, or the links work can contribute to ICH. There's so much that we can do together. And that's why I was very happy, Chris, when you invited people like myself to contribute to the work you're doing on ICH and climate change. And I think that's just a really good, great first step in the right direction. And the second point you raised about safeguarding versus transmitting is also something that I think is kind of similar vocabulary. And I guess my interpretation, my first instinct when I hear the word safeguarding is more like protecting, which doesn't necessarily give at first sight, or first hearing it, it doesn't really necessarily lend itself to more the dynamic nature, the flexible nature of knowledge and heritage itself. So I think that's kind of, and I know that's the vocabulary that's used. But when you talk about things like safeguarding nature, for example, it is mostly seen as something that you want to leave untouched. You don't want, it's more like protecting. And I feel like that vocabulary doesn't, it can be easily misunderstood to mean that you want it to keep that sort of heritage, intangible heritage, unchanged, which is obviously totally not necessarily conducive to more adaptation. Like, you want to make sure that culture is used, heritage is used, and continues to be used, continues to be adapt, continues to be to change, to be able to live as we all live, and change as societies and people change. So I think transmission is a very important component of local and indigenous knowledge, and without transmission, it cannot be used, and it cannot be changed, and it cannot be adapting. It cannot move and change with the times. So I think that's kind of, I know, my full ignorance, I guess, of the word that's used in the ICH context. But I think it is a bit of a, it is unfortunate in a way that that safeguarding at first, when you first hear it, makes it seem like it is not, it's not conducive to like dynamic nature of culture and local knowledge, for example. Yeah, I'm sure you have. I'm sure we can have a long conversation about this, Chris. And I probably need to learn a lot more about about the convention, and I would love to discuss more with you on this.
Thank you, Ms. Hiwasaki. I would like to give the floor back to Mr. Ballard if you have any further comments or further questions.
No further questions, and I basically agree with everything Lisa just said. Yes, the term safeguarding does give that sense of trying to freezing things, but the convention pushes back very strongly against that. Says this is absolutely not what we're doing. We had to choose a term. That was the term we chose. I do think the convention hasn't sufficiently explored the dynamism of what it is they're safeguarding, and hasn't probably explored this process of transmission. And so the way I think about transmission is from a DRR perspective. It's how does knowledge become vulnerable? At what points does the transmission of knowledge become vulnerable to perpetuating that knowledge, or to allowing that knowledge to adapt? And that comes back to Lisa's point about the flexibility of local and Indigenous knowledge. So I think there's a lot of work to be done within the convention on that. And lots of people are working on transmission, but largely in isolation from each other. So hopefully this seminar is part of that process of encouraging these conversations that Lisa was talking about between links and ICH, and between DRR and climate change adaptation.
So we have now reached the end of today's seminar. On behalf of IRCI, I extend our sincere gratitude to our esteemed lecturer, commentator, and all online participants for joining us. We hope that you have enjoyed this seminar and found it informative.